So in this course, we are going to be building a Placekitten clone. Now, if you're not sure what this is, when you are building out a site, you perhaps sometimes want an image that is a specific width and a specific height, but you want it to be interesting enough that it makes your design look fairly good. So in this case, what we can do with this Placekitten site is go ahead and pass in a width, pass in a height, and this will give us a random image of a cat, and it will do it at that specific width and height. So as you just saw just a moment ago, we have this here fully working. We can go ahead and provide any width and any height, and this will go ahead and pull out a random image for us, and it will go ahead and give it to us, of course, with that specific width and specific height. So the reason that I chose to build this project is we're looking at a few things. We're looking at the Silex framework. So this is a really nice micro framework based on Symfony. And what we're also going to be looking at is database support to pull out a random image from a list of images that we have in a database table. And of course, we're going to be looking at caching. So we have this really, really quick. So you can see that once I first request this, we've got about 197 milliseconds. But when I re-request this, we go right down. So things are super fast. And of course, the last thing we're actually looking at is the actual image manipulation itself. So there's a few things to do here. It's not too difficult, but if you are wanting to get into using Silex, we're going to cover a few core concepts that will give you a really good idea as to how to start working with this framework. And at the end of the course, you'll have built something really fun that you can perhaps go ahead and deploy and use if you want to. So that is pretty much it. Let's head over to the next part and get Silex set up and get this very quickly built out. All right, so we are starting out with a completely empty directory here, and the first thing that we're going to do is get Silex installed, get a basic structure set up that will not only serve us now, but into the future if we need to add anything, and then of course we'll move on. So the first thing to do is go ahead and install Silex. I'll leave a link to the documentation in the course link section if you need to come over here, but we very easily can just pull this in using Composer. So let's come over and inside of the directory we're working in, do a composer require on Silex/Silex and go ahead and wait for this to finish. Okay, so that's done. Now for a fairly small project like this, I still kind of break this up just in case, like I said, I need to add anything to it. So I usually create a public folder in here just for any public assets. We'll be moving all of our cat images over to this folder as well later. But the first thing I do inside of here is just create an index.php file. This will just be the kind of landing point of our application. So what we need to do now is just come over and create some kind of bootstrap folder where we need to bootstrap anything up that our app needs. And in our case, we're just going to have a very simple app.php file. Now this will be responsible for just pulling in our vendor autoload file. So let's go ahead and require in dir, and let's go back into the vendor folder and then go ahead and pull in autoload.php. So we'll go ahead and set our app up in here in a minute, but for now over on index, we want to require this bootstrap file in, and then from within here, we can go ahead and run our app. So very, very simple structure, but it's pretty effective to work with a small project. So we want to go into the bootstrap directory, requiring app.php, and we're pretty much done. Down here, we'll run our app in just a moment, but of course we need to get everything else set up in here as well. Okay, so let's create an app variable just here, and to pull in Silex, or at least boot Silex up, we just go ahead and new up a application class as part of Silex. And what I'm also going to do for the purpose of this is just turn debugging on, just so if we come across any errors, we get that output and we can fix anything up. So now that we've done this, we over on our index.php file, because we've required this bootstrap file in, very simply, we can just run our app. Now in between this, we need to include our roots. So again, I usually create a folder for this, and depending on what I'm doing, I just break these up. So in this case, I'm going to create a web.php file. If I had any API roots, I'd maybe create an API file. Again, you can structure this really however you want. So now that we have that over in our bootstrap file, we can very easily require this in. So let's go ahead and pull this file in so it's in there. So again, we go back a directory, we go into roots, and we require web.php in. And we can set up a very simple route in just a moment. For now, what I want to do is just create an htaccess file in here, just so if we do create our routes, we don't run into any problems. Now, I already have this created, so I'm going to go ahead and pull it over. It's pretty much from the Silex documentation, and I'm working with Apache. If you're working with Nginx, this will be slightly different, but shouldn't be too bad. So now that we have this done, let's get rid of that, and we should be good to go. So we can come over to here. We obviously know that the entry point is public, and looks like we've got a little error here in our Bootstrap file on line 3. So let's just head over to this, and of course I didn't concatenate this properly. Perfect. So give that a refresh, and there we go. So we obviously see this error because we don't have a route for the home page, but that's absolutely fine. We don't need to worry about that just yet. So let's look at just auto loading everything in. Then we'll go ahead and create a very simple route just to test this out. And then of course we'll move on to making this all work. So we're going to have an app folder because we're going to be registering a Silex service provider, which we're going to need to auto load from somewhere, from some kind of class. So I'm going to create an app directory in here, and then I'm going to update my composer.json file to auto load files from here using the PSR4 standard. So all we do is give our app a root namespace. In this case, I'm just going to call it app, but of course, what you could do is give it a name of whatever project it is. In this case, it'd probably be Placecat. And then we tell Composer where we're loading them files from. And in this case, it's app. So now that we've done that, we just need to do a Composer dump auto load. So that's all registered in there, and we are pretty much good to go. So that's just very, very simple. Okay, so let's create a really simple route just to test this out. It's very, very simple because we have app in scope here. We can just say get /. We can go ahead and create a closure in here. We can use controllers, but for this it's going to be very simple. So we're only going to define out one route. And in here we can just return a response maybe. So what I'm going to do is pull in the response object so we can actually return that. We are going to be using that later, so it's worth pulling it in now anyway. So let's go ahead and use Symfony. And this is under component, and it's under HTTP Foundation. And we also have a request, so I'm going to pull that in as well. And why don't we go ahead and pull in our response too? So I'm going to use the PHP 7 update to pulling in things like so, just so we don't have to duplicate this down onto a new line. So I really like this. So let's just return a response in here. Let's go ahead and give null a 200 status code, and we should see something in the browser. So what we could do, in fact, if we just fix that up, is just return home, just to kind of see something on the page at least. Give that a refresh, and we see home. So that is our basic application set up and ready to go. The source code for this, all of this as its plain form, will be in the course downloads if you don't want to go ahead and get this set up, or you already know how to get a Silex application set up. So you can go ahead and grab that if you're having any problems setting up this base application. The only thing I want to kind of do is just pull in my request here, so we have anything from the request that we can use. And we also have things like our Silex app as well. So what we can do is just go ahead and say Silex application. This will give us an app instance that we can use to access anything out of the container. And that is pretty much it. So if we just go ahead and make sure we didn't break anything, looks good. And we can kind of use this when we set up our route for our width and our height, which will again later return an image. Either way, that is pretty much a basic Silex app setup, and we're ready to move on. Now that we have our app set up, we are going to dive into our database. We're going to create a table which will represent each image. And then from that, what we can do is extract a random row from our database table. We'll map that to an image that we have in storage, and then we'll go ahead and eventually return the actual image. For now, what we're going to be doing is just looking at how we grab this from the database. Now, the first thing that we need to do is install Doctrine Debow. So let's go over and pull this in using Composer. This will just provide an object relational mapper that we can use within Silex. So let's require in Doctrine Debow, and we'll set this up when it's finished. Okay, so now that that's done, we need to configure this, and we can do this within Bootstrap app because we need to attach this to our application. So what we're going to do is go ahead and register this on our application. And in here, we go ahead and pull in the provider for this. So it's under Silex, under provider, and it's our Doctrine service provider. Very, very simple. And then inside of this, what we want to do is go ahead and pass in some configuration. So in this case, what we do is we say DB options. We can register multiple database connections in here, but of course at the moment we only need one. And we just basically provide everything in here that we need. So we need a driver, and I'm just going to be using MySQL, but you can pretty much use anything you want. So we're going to go ahead and define that in. We also need our host, which is pretty simple. Again, we're just working locally. So we have localhost, and we have a database name, which in my case, I have called PlaceCat. So again, create a database if you haven't already. We have a user, so pretty standard stuff, which again is root for me. We have a password, again, this is root. And then we have our character encoding as well. So in this case, it's UTF-8 and it's MB4, like so. So let's fix that up and we're done. So that is our database configuration set up. Now over in our root, we need to kind of create this out a little bit so we can actually pass in a width and a height. So we'll set that up now. We don't really need it at the moment because regardless of the width and the height of the image that we're requesting, we always pull out an image at some point. We're going to cache it later, but we always need an image. So I'm going to go ahead and update the URI just for now, and I'm going to simply provide two placeholders in here. So what we can now do, rather than access home, which now of course doesn't exist, we go ahead and say something like 200 by 200 or literally any size at all. This will work for any size at all. So now that we've got that in there, the other thing I want to do is kind of make sure that a width and a height is always some kind of number, and also always a positive number, which is really important. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the assert method here to say that we want the width, and we're going to use a regular expression here. So we're just going to very simply say 0 to 9, and we're going to use plus to make sure that this is unsigned. So it has to be a positive number. Of course, we can't have an image with a width and a height that's negative. So we go ahead and use assert again, and we do the same thing for height. Very, very simple. We just pass in 0 to 9, and again, we make sure this is unsigned, so it has to be positive. So give that a refresh. It works in exactly the same way, but now if we provide some silly value in here that's not a number, it just doesn't recognize the root. Okay, so now that we've done this, we already pulled in app just here from the last part, so we can actually use this to go ahead and grab that from the database because we've now registered this on our app. So this is really, really simple. All we're going to do is create a variable called image, and we're going to be kind of switching this around in a minute or a bit later, because we've got a couple of other things that we want to do here. But really simply for now, what we can do is just access appdb. We can go ahead and fetch an associative array back from a query that we give. Now this is really simple. We just need to select something like a file name. So I'll go ahead and write this out before we put this into the database, just so we kind of know what we're doing. And this is maybe going to be from an images table, and that is pretty much it. So that's all we need to do for now. What we could also do at this point is order this by random. So that kind of helps, and we're going to limit this by 1. So that will just give us a random record from this table. Okay, so now that we've kind of figured out how to do this, let's just do a var dump on image here. Go ahead and kill the page, and we'll set our database up and get our images into a location that we can pull them out from. So the images table, as we know, we're extracting from this, and we know that we have a file name just in here. This is going to be a varchar, maybe 255, it can be anything. And really what we want to do now is just kind of map this to files that we have on our file system. So over in public, I'm going to create a folder in here, maybe called image, and I'm going to go ahead and copy over a load of images to here. So if we come over to public, I'm just going to pull over a load of cat images. I'll leave a link to all of these in the course download, so you could go ahead and grab these. Let's make sure they're in the image directory, and we now have 1 to 10 of images. Perfect. So now that all we need to do is just go and say 1.jpg, and of course you could host these elsewhere. You can do really whatever you want here, but it's generally a lot easier to do this on the file system. So we can just go ahead and duplicate these down now, and make sure we have 1 to 10 in here, so we're always plucking out one of these. So I'll just quickly go ahead and duplicate these down, and I'll be back with you in just a second. Okay, so these have been duplicated down now. We now have 10 images in here, 1 JPEG through to 10 JPEG, and we have them in the database as well. So now that we're picking out a random image, we should have the ability to map that. So if we give this a refresh, we can see 5.jpg, give it another refresh, we see 7, and so on and so forth. So this will just pick this out in a random order. Okay, so now that we have done that, we pretty much have a random image that we can do something with. The next thing that we need to do is actually respond with our cropped image. So we need to reduce the width and the height. We need to actually return this in the response rather than home. So let's go ahead and just revert this back. Let's go ahead and stick null in there because we of course need to change that over. And we'll go over to the next part and look at how we use intervention image to manipulate this image and then respond with it. Okay, so now that we have a randomly selected image, we need to manipulate this and go ahead and actually respond with it. Then we'll work on things like caching and all the other features that we want to implement. Now we're going to be using a package called intervention image, which is a really nice way to manipulate things, either using the GD library or the Imagic library. We're going to be using the GD library, but it's pretty straightforward and we're not going to be diving too much into this. All we really need to do is reduce the size, make it grayscale, and we're pretty much done. Now there is a little bit of work we're going to do around this because we're going to create a service provider for this, and we'll look at how this works. So let's go ahead and get this installed. We'll create a Silex service provider for this, and then we'll look at how we use it within our root really nicely, and then we can reuse it elsewhere if we need to. So first thing is, let's go ahead and actually install this. So we're going to use Composer again to require this in, and this is under intervention and then /image. So we'll wait for this to finish as always, and we'll get this included. Okay, so now we want to, rather than just start using this within our root and get into a little bit of a mess, I'm going to create a providers folder over here. We'll go ahead and create our own Silex service provider, which is really useful knowledge because then any kind of service you pull into a Silex application, you can reuse. And we're going to go ahead and create an image service provider. So feel free to call this whatever you like. You can make it as specific as you like. It really doesn't matter. Now, with any service provider, we need to implement the Pimple service provider interface. So let's go over to service provider interface, and Pimple comes as part of Silex. So we can just have a look at this interface, see what we need to do, and we need a register method in here. That's all we need. And we need to have an instance of the Pimple container into this as well. So let's go ahead and pull these in. So let's first of all set the namespace for this because we are using PSR4 auto loading for this. So we have app providers, and let's use Pimple container because we know that we need that inside of that register method. And let's also go ahead and use Pimple service provider interface. And again, I'm going to use this syntax for pulling in my namespaces because they are under the same root namespace. So let's go ahead and say provider interface, and we're pretty much done. So we're going to create an image service provider class, of course, and we're going to implement the service provider interface. And then we need that register method in there. So we can just go ahead and create this like so. And then into this, we know that we get a container instance in, and we can just call this app. It's usually convention that we call this app. It just makes it a little bit easier when you're writing code down here rather than naming this Pimple. Okay, so now that we've done that, we need to figure out how to actually pull in intervention image. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. We can do this either by using a kind of facade, a static class, or we can use the intervention image manager. And I much prefer this method. So we're going to say intervention and then image manager. And we're basically just going to bind this onto the container. So to do this, we say app, we give it the name that we want. In this case, we're just going to call it image. And this is how we pull it out of the container. And then we're going to say app factory. And then inside of here, we give a closure and we just return whatever we need. And in this case, we're returning a new image manager. So this is now bound onto the container once we register this with our app, and we can use this anywhere that we have our app instance available. So let's go ahead and register this, and then within our root, we can very easily use this with app image. So over in Bootstrap app, we just register this as normal, so much like we did with our Doctrine service provider, but of course this is our own service provider now. So let's say app register, and we create a new app providers, and of course it's our image service provider. And of course you can import these at the top if you prefer. It doesn't really matter too much. So let's go ahead and just give this a refresh, make sure we didn't break anything. Everything looks good. So we can come over to our roots and start to use this inside of here. So we know the location of the image. We know that our images are inside of public image, and we know that we get a file name through this query that we created earlier. So now really all we need to do is map this up to intervention image. We can manipulate using intervention image, and then we're pretty much ready to go. So to do this, let's go ahead and create some kind of placeholder variable. We'll be again fiddling around with this later because we really need to cache these images. We don't want these to be pulled out and then manipulated every single time you make a request. We want to cache these for speed. So we're going to say app image, because remember we have our app instance in here, and we're going to go ahead and use the make method. So we're now using intervention image methods in here to go ahead and pull in an image, manipulate it, and then respond with it. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and pull in the current directory here. We're going to go back a directory into public. We're going to go into image, and then we're going to basically, using the result from that query that we used earlier, we're going to grab the file name. So we now have that image ready to start manipulating. And I'm just going to kind of pull this down onto a new line because we need to chain on a lot of methods here. So now all we need to do is fit this to a specific width and a specific height. Now, we don't have access to these two placeholder values at the moment, and all we do is just add these onto here. So I'm going to say width, height, and so on and so forth, depending on how many placeholders you have. Now we can say we want to fit this to a width and a height that's provided in the URL. We want to make it grayscale. So all of these kind of methods here are available on the intervention image documentation. So if you need to do anything else to these, feel free to refer to that documentation. Now what we need to do is create a response for this placeholder. So very simply, we say response, PNG, and we're done. We now literally have a PNG image. So we can't really just say, well, I want to place that inside of the response. We can do, but what we'll get is if we just fix up the path here, so you can see we've got image, but we didn't add a slash just on the end of there, we should now see the raw image data, which is not good. So what we want to do is inside of the response, send over some headers. Now we know that when we respond, we're using a PNG all the time, regardless of the source type of the image. So as a third argument to our response, we can simply start to pass in some headers. So we want to tell the browser that we have a content type here of image/PNG, like so, and that is pretty much it. So grabbing a random image from the database, looking that image up, and responding with that image at the width and the height that we've requested. Give it a refresh, and we see a cat. Perfect. And of course, if we refresh this, we get a random selected one every single time. So that's pretty straightforward. What we can now do is start to change this around. So I can say 500, I could change this to 200, and we get the same thing. So works really well. Of course, they're cut off a little bit, but I'll leave you to fiddle around with that depending on the images that you use. But that is pretty much the basis of it. That's how easy it is. Now, we can't really stop here, because if we are using this as a service, if you were building a service like this, you really need these images to be as fast as possible. And the problem with this is we're always going ahead and fitting this to a width and a height. We're always processing this as grayscale, so it's taking a little bit longer than it should do. And we can kind of see this if we open up our network tab over here and go ahead and give this a refresh. You can see that this is actually taking, if we pull this out, 172 milliseconds. Now that doesn't seem a long time, but ideally what we want to do is once we have at a specific width and a height manipulated this image, cache it, and then just serve that image back to us if it already exists. So with that said, what we want to do is go over it in the next part and look at caching our rendered images. So now it's time to cache the images. As we've already discovered, this is going to be a lot quicker, of course, because we're doing image processing. Now, I really like using this service provider for caching. It's really, really flexible. And we're going to go ahead and implement this, set up file-based caching. But of course, later down the line, if you wanted to use this package, it's very, very flexible. So you can use any caching driver you want. So let's come over and install this first of all, and we will look at how we set this up. So very simply do a composer require on this, wait for it to finish, and we'll go get set up. Okay, so that's done. I'll leave a link to this in the course link so you can go ahead and grab this. Let's go over and start to create out a caching directory. Maybe we had another directory with a cache directory in it. In this case, what I'm going to do is literally just create a cache directory in here, and then maybe have some kind of images directory inside of this. But of course, feel free to structure this however you want. Okay, so now that we've got this directory, of course, what we need to do with this service provider is register it on our application as we've done with everything else. And then of course, pass in the options as well to say where we're caching to, which driver we're using and all that kind of stuff. So somewhere around here, let's go ahead and register this. And this is under this package namespace, and it's under Silex provider, and it's a cache service provider. And now what we need to do is go ahead and pass in our options. So cache options in here, and then we can just go ahead and pass these in. Now this is really simple. We just need a driver, which is a file-based driver, and we need the cache directory, which we use if we're using file-based caching. Now in this case, we can just grab the current directory, we can go back into cache and then into images, and that is pretty much it. So now we can use this inside of our root to retrieve an image from the cache if it's previously been stored. Now, the way that we're going to do this is, first of all, attempt to get from the cache. And if it doesn't exist, so if it's not in there, we're going to process the image as we're doing down below, and then we're going to store it into the cache. So this is just a kind of common way to look something up in a cache. If it's not in there, we go ahead and do whatever we need to do. We store it back into the cache, and then on the next request, if we do attempt to get it from the cache, we're probably likely to see it in there, and we can just use that value from the cache. So let's go and first of all say that our placeholder is, instead of this, so we'll add this into a conditional, we want to say app cache. So this is how we access that package now. We want to go ahead and fetch at a particular key. Now, what we want to cache by is the width and the height. So if we say we request a 200 by 500 image, we want to grab a random image, we want to cache this, and the next time we request 200 by 500, this is simply returned from the cache. Now, the only downside to this is you're always going to get the same picture, but there's not really a way around it. You can't then reprocess another random image but not cache it. So that's really the only way to get around this. So what we do is we fetch by a specific key. We're going to choose the key, and this is going to be the file name. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop these in here. We're going to separate these out by a colon, and then we're going to say the width, and we're going to say the height, like so. So that's just pretty standard. And what we're going to do is, at the same time as fetching this, we're going to go ahead and grab the cache key so we can store this at that particular key as we've checked it. So we're kind of checking it, setting the key, and then down here we can use that same key to go ahead and set it, just so we don't have to repeat any code. Okay, so now down here, if the placeholder is false, which will be returned if we don't have anything in the cache, we want to store it into the cache. And to do this, we only need to do this when we can't retrieve it from the cache. So this is the only time we're ever going to be processing an image. So now what we can do is, after this, we can store it into the cache, and then we can return the version of that image. So we'll return this if it's not in the cache. We'll go ahead and store it here otherwise, and then on the next request, this will be true, or it will at least hold a value. So then we'll just return the placeholder. This is why we're using the same name. So now down here, we're just going to say app cache, and we're going to store this at the cache key that we assigned as we looked it up, and we're simply going to place the placeholder into the cache. So just to kind of reiterate, if you are new to caching, again, we check if this is in the cache, setting the cache key. If it's not, we process the image and store it in the cache, and then either way, whether it is in the cache or not in the cache, we return with that image. Very, very simple. Let's go over. We know that we're getting a time of about 137 to 150 milliseconds. Give it a refresh. This time around, it will be a little bit slower because it's the first request. But now when we refresh again, and it looks like we've got a little error, so let's go ahead and just have a look. So file name in web online 8. Let's have a look here. Of course, so in this case, it's not file name. It is, in fact, image file name, but I think in this case actually we could probably just get rid of that. I think the width and the height is enough to satisfy our cache key. So give this another refresh and we see again 153 milliseconds, but now when we refresh we're getting a much lower response time because of course what's happening now is it's just being pulled out of the cache, not manipulated anyway, and just returned to the user. So there we go, that is our caching of our images done, very, very simply using that package, very nice to work with. And what we can now move on to is in the next part, looking at if we perhaps want a specific image to be pulled out. So for example, I might want to say image equals and then give the ID of the image that I always want, then we can use that to specifically return an image that we want. So at the moment it's not going to work, but we need to do a little bit of updating to use a specific image if we want to. Alright then, so if I want to use a specific image by its ID, I need to be able to pass it into the query string and I must have that image returned to me at the size that I gave, but we also need to think about caching as well. So we're going to need to update a little bit in here as well. So we have all of our images inside of cache images. We can go ahead and remove these if we need to. The first thing I want to do is update this to go ahead and adjust my query based on that query string that we pass in. So the best way to do this, because we need to kind of modify the query, we want to kind of keep the same thing. We don't want to repeat this line of code within an if statement. What I like to do is say something like clause and then inject that into the query. And then of course we need to use prepared statements for this because we're passing something from the query string directly into our query. So we need to think about security here as well. So what we're going to do is using the request that we have inside of here, we can actually say get image and that will give us that value that we use in the query string. So if we just kill the page here and go ahead and just die and dump on clause or just kill the page on clause, give that a refresh, we see 5. So we have that value now that we can use to check. Now I'm going to do a ternary here to check if that is a value because this will be null otherwise. And then I'm going to say where ID equals and then a question mark that I can later bind in. So we're checking if that exists. The clause will be a specific ID, which will pull out one image only. Now, otherwise, we basically just want to order by rand and then limit to 1. So we can go ahead and get rid of this and pop that in there. And then really simply into here, we can just place our clause. So we can put that in there. And now depending on whether that's been passed into the query string, we now have either where ID equals 1 or 2 or 3 up to 10, which will always return us one image, or we're ordering by random and we're limiting by 1. Now, of course, at the moment, we're not actually passing the ID of the image in. So we need to do this within an array as the second argument. And this is just the value that we want to bind in or the values we want to bind in order if we had more than one. And of course, we know where that comes from. It comes from request and we say get image like so. Now, it doesn't matter if we're ordering by rand, limiting by 1, and we're passing this in as well. So we do have this passed in even if we don't have something in, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter too much. It's not going to affect the way it works. So now that we've done this, we know that this is going to give us back a specific image. If I just go ahead and refresh here, I don't think this is actually image 5. So even if we change this over, notice that we're still getting the same item back. So what we really need to go ahead and do is update our cache so this takes this into account. Now by this, I mean that we're going to add onto here the image that we're potentially requesting. So we're going to say request get image. And now of course that's not going to exist in the cache. So now what we can do is for a specific width, a specific height and a specific image, we can grab this and go ahead and cache it based on that as well. So this is just making it a little bit more unique. Now what we can do then is come over here and say, well, I want image 1. And there we go, we have image 1. We can change the width and the height over, and of course that will still bring us back image 1, but of course it will cache it at this specific width and at this specific height. So we can go ahead and change this as well if we want to. We could do the same width and height for image 2. That would cache that at 500 by 500. We can adjust that and still get image 2. So now we pretty much have the caching in place, but we have more flexibility to pull out a specific image if we want to. And there we go. That is how we update this to specify the image that we want to see, but still cache it for that width and for that height, so we speed up our responses.